Hello, so in this video I'm going to talk about the way my faction system is going to work for my survival game.
So, for those of you who have never heard of the game Elite Dangerous, they have this thing called a background simulation that is always running at all times, and they have all these procedurally generated factions that exist all over the galaxy. And what they do is every so often there's like a simulation cycle where changes happen in and around the factions based on the results of the previous simulation cycle, and pretty much dictate what actions the factions will take during the next simulation cycle. If I'm working on a survival game, I 100% wanted there to be NPCs that you'll eventually be able to trade with and battle with, that sort of thing. But I have always wanted to implement this sort of procedural faction system into a game.
So as you can see from this scene I've set up here, I've made settlements and encampments, which are like smaller settlements. I liked the idea of, over the course of the simulation, factions expanding into the wilderness, the main frontier of the game, which is another central pillar to the game I'll talk about in another video. But most importantly, if I decided to have, let's say, a giant procedurally generated game world, where at the beginning many factions, or small groups of factions, start off remote and isolated from each other, and they must expand their region of activity into this frontier to interact with other factions, then that means the most important part of our procedural faction system is going to be the way our factions are programmed to interact with each other. This is where a lot of inspiration is taken from Elite Dangerous's background simulation system, where the actions taken for the next simulation cycle are decided by the results of the previous simulation cycle. But the system I'm going to create is going to be a little different, so there are a lot of problems to solve. Specifically, the background simulation in Elite Dangerous runs on Frontier Dev's servers, and your game experience is your game client making API calls to their server, and having separate lobbies for each star system that has players in it. At least that's how I assume it works. For me, this survival game is just going to be single player, so I need this background faction simulation system to run on the same hardware, still making use of the idea of having the game make API calls to a server that runs with the game. Just an idea at the moment. So now one of the last things I'll have to figure out is how inter-faction trading will work. A lot of it might end up being smoke and mirrors, so I'll work on it later. The most exciting last thing to figure out is how faction battles will take place. In our background simulation, these battles can be simple, where traits, properties, and resources between battling factions are compared, and a timer is run, and at the end of the battle, results are chosen. But if the player stumbles upon a battle region in the game world, the game should know the progress of the battle, so it can accurately set game data, like which faction has captured a settlement, which faction is losing, and instantiate NPCs and stuff based on this. This way, if the game is running a battle in the background simulation, and the player walks to that battle region in the game world, the game doesn't have to just decide to show you a real battle starting from the beginning, but can instead be dynamically loaded into the scene based on the data from the battle in the background simulation in real time. On our part, this means using our background simulation system to track some more complex data from the battle, like how many soldiers are alive and whatnot, and use that to create a battle in the game world that has seemingly already started and progressed since before the player's arrival. When it comes to these real-time battles in the real world, this will be the actual game that the player will see, while the background simulation is like a more low-level guiding hand for all the AI systems that end up being instantiated at a given time in the game, hopefully giving an illusion of a constantly churning social ecosystem, but procedurally generated, and will hopefully result in some interesting emergent behavior. Now that we have a basic idea for the framework of the faction simulation system,
I'm starting to think about how factions are going to act, like their behaviors. So there's a couple more details to iron out with the idea for our background simulation.
So our background simulation will be able to evolve faction properties and data over time, which shouldn't be too much of a challenge, but the hard part will be determining how to manifest these factions in the game world and accurately manifest the changes that happen to them. Obviously this can be up in the air for now, but it's something that must be thought about while I design the behaviors of the factions. As for how these aspects of my background simulation will be manifested in the game world, I thought it would be best to break down some of the necessary components. When it comes to the faction system and spawning NPCs, enemies, spawning battles, buildings, and whatnot, I thought I should start out by using some abstractions I'm calling nodes and regions. One of the settlements controlled by any given faction will be chosen as its capital. This capital will act as the central node for all faction-wide regions. One region factions will have will be called their control region. If we have this world map and generate a bunch of factions in their capitals, then this region will fill the space between each faction. I believe there's a name for this type of algorithm. If you know it, please let me know because that would be very helpful. This control region can be seen as the area which each faction claims as theirs, and each simulation cycle, each faction will attempt to expand into their control regions. To expand, factions will establish new settlements or encampments. This brings us to our next faction region, which is the region of activity, or active region. This region exists inside the control region for each faction, and surrounds only all the encampments and settlements for that faction, delineating the region where NPCs for that faction might spawn. If new settlements or encampments are established for a region, their active region expands. So now that we have some sort of mechanism for factions exploring the wild frontier and expanding their influence, we can get creative and, let's say, have the rate of expansion be dependent on certain faction properties or traits. Maybe more imperial factions will spread their influence faster. So from this point, the factions will expand through the world, and inevitably, eventually those regions of activity will expand into each other and collide. When two active regions meet, the factions will interact. So this is where we get to be creative again. The way the two factions will interact will be based on their traits. To keep it simple for now, two things can happen when factions meet. They will form an alliance and establish trade routes, or engage in battle and attempt to further expand their active regions. So this is the fundamentals of how I want factions to interact. If factions meet, they'll either battle or engage in trade. So in the next video, I'm probably gonna try to get some of this stuff up and running in Godot, and then probably start figuring out what actually happens when factions make alliances and start trading, or when they engage in battle. Thanks for watching.